If you're going to insult someone, make sure they don't understand you. Ethan Whitmore said in Arabic without looking up, his voice smooth, dismissive, practiced, the kind of tone that had closed billion-dollar deals and ended conversations before they began. The crystal glass in his hand catching the soft golden light of the private dining room, while rain traced quiet lines down the tall Manhattan windows and across the table. His investors nodded politely, unaware of the words he had just used, unaware of the line he had just crossed, because to them it sounded like nothing more than background conversation. Another language floating above expensive plates and measured smiles. But Claire Bennett heard every word, standing just a few feet away with a tray balanced in steady hands, her posture composed, her face calm, the kind of calm that didn't come from ignorance but from control, from knowing exactly when to speak and when silence carried more weight. She stepped forward, placed the coffee down gently beside him, the porcelain barely making a sound against the polished table. And for a moment she said nothing, just the faint clink of a spoon, the quiet hum of a room that had no idea it was about to shift. Then she spoke, not louder, not sharper, just clear, precise Arabic that cut through the air like a line drawn in ink, correcting his words, repeating them back with a nuance he hadn't even realized he'd used, and adding one simple sentence that made his hand stop mid-motion. And people like you forget that respect translates faster than money. The room didn't react at first, not immediately, but something changed, something subtle. The oldest investor lifted his head, eyes narrowing with interest. Another leaned forward slightly, listening now, really listening. While Ethan finally looked up, properly looked this time, not at a waitress, not at a uniform, but at the woman standing in front of him with steady eyes and no trace of apology. And for the first time that night, he didn't speak, he just watched. Because the control he carried so easily had slipped. Just enough to notice, just enough to feel. Claire didn't wait for permission, didn't ask. She turned slightly toward the investors and clarified the earlier statement, correcting a translation error that had been quietly poisoning the conversation for the last 10 minutes. Her tone respectful, accurate, precise, explaining not just the words but the meaning behind them, the cultural weight Ethan had unknowingly dismissed. And as she spoke, the tension that had been building in the room shifted, softened. The deal that had been drifting toward failure suddenly had direction again, and somewhere between her calm voice and the silence that followed, Ethan realized something uncomfortable, something he couldn't immediately explain. He hadn't just misjudged a waitress. He had underestimated the one person in the room who actually understood everything. And as the rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the glass like a quiet applause, he set his glass down slowly, no longer interested in the drink, only in the question forming in his mind. Who was she, really, and how had he just missed it so completely? The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like the air itself had learned something new, and Claire felt it without looking up, the weight of attention settling in directions it had ignored her just seconds ago. But she did not react, did not linger. She simply adjusted the silverware beside the nearest plate, precise, almost ritual, as if nothing unusual had happened, because to her, this was not a performance. It was a line she had drawn long before tonight. Ethan watched her in a way he had not watched anyone in years, not as a distraction, not as a passing detail, but as a problem he could not immediately solve, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Where did you learn that?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of the effortless dominance it had carried before. Claire did not look at him right away. She finished aligning the glass with the edge of the table, then met his gaze with a calm that did not challenge him, but did not yield either. "I listen," she said, simple, almost too simple, but it was not an answer, not really, and he knew it. The older investor leaned back slightly, studying her with interest that bordered on recognition, his fingers tapping once against the table before he spoke in Arabic again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if testing not her ability, but her understanding. Claire responded without hesitation, not just translating the words, but adjusting the tone, softening an edge that could have been taken as offense. And the man nodded, satisfied, not impressed, but respectful. And in that moment, Ethan understood something uncomfortable. She was not proving herself. She was protecting the room from breaking apart. The conversation resumed, But it was different now, more careful, more aware, and Claire stepped back into the quiet rhythm of service, refilling water, clearing plates, moving through the space like she had before, except now every movement was seen, every pause noticed. Ethan tried to return to the deal, to the numbers, to the structure he trusted, but his attention kept slipping, drawn back to the same question: how does someone like her end up here? He had built his entire life on reading people quickly, accurately, finding leverage, identifying value, and yet he had missed her completely, not just underestimated, but overlooked, and that was not a mistake he tolerated. When the main course arrived, he did not thank her out of habit. He paused, just long enough to make it intentional. "Claire," he said, using her name for the first time. And something in the room noticed that too. "Stay for a moment." It was not a request, but it was no longer a command either. She hesitated, not out of fear, but calculation. The manager would not approve. The floor was still full, but the investors were watching, and she understood rooms like this better than most people realized. She set the tray down slowly, her hands steady, and remained standing, not sitting, not lowering herself into their space, just present. "You corrected more than a translation," Ethan said, his voice measured now, almost analytical. "You corrected intent." Claire held his gaze, and for a brief second, there was something behind her eyes, not anger, not pride, something quieter, something older. "Language is not just words," she said. "It is what people are willing to admit out loud." The table fell silent again, not shocked this time, but thoughtful, and Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her as if he were seeing a version of the world he had never accounted for, a version where control did not come from money or status, but from understanding what others could not hear. And as the rain outside softened into a steady whisper against the glass, he realized the balance in the room had already shifted, and he was no longer the one who understood it best. The conversation did not return to normal. It evolved, slower, more deliberate, as if every word now carried weight it had not before, and Claire could feel it in the pauses between sentences, in the way the investors no longer spoke over one another, in the way even the smallest misunderstanding was now met with careful silence instead of quick assumption. She stepped back into motion, refilling a glass, adjusting a plate, her presence once again quiet, but no longer invisible, and Ethan noticed that more than anything else. Not her fluency, not her composure, but the way the entire room had recalibrated around her without her asking for it. That was not something he could measure, not something he could buy, and it unsettled him in a way numbers never had. He glanced down at the contract resting near his hand, the ink still untouched, the terms still negotiable. But now he understood that what had nearly collapsed this deal was not strategy. It was something far more subtle, something he had overlooked because he believed it could not be quantified. The oldest investor spoke again, his tone lighter now, almost conversational. But there was a test beneath it, another phrase in Arabic, layered with cultural nuance, something that would reveal whether Claire truly understood or had simply memorized. And once again she answered, but this time she did not translate directly. She adjusted, softened, added a phrase that acknowledged respect for family legacy, something that was never explicitly said but always expected, and the man smiled. A real smile this time, not polite, not guarded, and he nodded once, slowly, the kind of nod that carried decision within it. Ethan saw it, recognized it. The deal was no longer at risk. It was shifting toward acceptance, and the realization landed quietly but firmly, not because of him, not because of his preparation, but because of her. Claire stepped back again, returning to the rhythm of service, but something had changed inside her as well, a slight tension in her shoulders, a controlled breath she released only once she turned away. She had crossed a line she had spent years avoiding. Drawing attention was never part of her plan. Blending in had been safer, simpler, predictable, but tonight she had chosen otherwise, not for recognition, not for reward, but because she could not ignore what she understood, and that choice carried consequences she was already calculating. Behind her, Ethan pushed his chair back slightly, not enough to stand, but enough to break his own pattern, his eyes following her as she moved toward the kitchen doors, his mind no longer on the contract, not fully, but on the gap between who she appeared to be and who she actually was, a gap that did not make sense, not in his world, not in any world he trusted. He had built empires by finding hidden value, by uncovering what others missed, and yet she had been standing in front of him all night, unnoticed until she chose otherwise. And that meant one thing he did not like admitting: he had not been in control of this room, not completely. And as the rain outside slowed to a soft, steady rhythm, tapping gently against the glass like a quiet reminder, Ethan Whitmore realized he was no longer leading the conversation. He was trying to understand it. And somewhere between the silence and her final glance before disappearing behind the kitchen doors, he knew this was not over. Not for him, not for her, because people like Claire Bennett did not appear by accident, and they did not stay unnoticed once they were seen. The kitchen doors had barely settled when the energy inside the room shifted again, quieter now, heavier, as if something important had just passed through and left a trace behind. Ethan did not pick up his fork, did not look at the contract. He simply stared at the empty space where Claire had stood seconds ago, replaying every word, every pause, every choice she had made, not as a customer, but as a strategist dissecting a move he did not anticipate. Across from him, the investors exchanged low comments in Arabic, no longer guarded, no longer testing, but acknowledging, and he caught fragments: respect, precision, restraint, words rarely offered lightly, especially not in rooms like this. The oldest investor turned back to Ethan, his expression calm, measured, but different now. "Your associate," he said slowly in English. "She understands more than language." Ethan did not correct him, did not clarify that Claire was not his associate, not part of his team, not even part of his world, because in that moment, that distinction felt weaker than it should have. She prevented a misunderstanding. The man continued, and showed respect where it was needed. Ethan nodded once, controlled, but inside something tightened. Not pride, not relief, something sharper: recognition. He had nearly lost control of this deal because he had assumed he understood the room better than anyone else. And she had corrected that without asking for credit, without stepping forward, without even staying to be acknowledged. The kind of power that did not announce itself. And that made it far more dangerous. The contract was slid closer to him, the pen resting beside it like a quiet invitation, but Ethan did not reach for it yet. Instead, he leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing in thought, recalculating not the numbers, but the variables he had missed, because people like Claire Bennett did not exist by accident, not with that level of control, that level of awareness, that kind of silence. Someone had trained her, or life had forced her into something sharper than training ever could. And either way, she did not belong behind a serving tray, not in any version of the world he trusted. Across the room, the manager stepped briefly into view near the kitchen entrance, his posture tense, his glance quick, searching for disruption, for complaints, for anything that could threaten the balance of the evening. But there was none, only a room that had quietly realigned itself, and he retreated again. Unaware that the most important shift had already happened, Ethan finally reached for the pen, his movement deliberate, controlled, and signed his name in one smooth motion, the ink settling into paper with finality. The deal was secured. The room exhaled, glasses lifted, quiet congratulations exchanged. But Ethan did not smile, did not celebrate, because the victory did not feel like his, not entirely. And as the others spoke, his attention drifted again, not to the numbers, not to the future gains, but to the unanswered question that now carried more weight than the contract itself. Who was Claire Bennett before she became invisible? And why had she chosen to stay that way? He set the pen down slowly, his reflection faint in the polished surface of the table. And for the first time in years, he realized he was not finished with the situation just because the deal was done. Some things did not end with a signature. Some things only began there. And as the kitchen door opened briefly, in the distance, letting out a soft line of light before closing again, Ethan Whitmore understood one thing with absolute clarity. He was going to find out who she really was, not out of curiosity alone, but because something about her had already changed the rules of the room, and he did not walk away from anything that could do that. The celebration around the table continued in soft tones, glasses touching lightly, voices measured, controlled, but Ethan had already stepped away from it without moving, his attention fixed on something no one else in the room seemed to notice: the absence of Claire Bennett, The space she had occupied now felt deliberate, like a missing piece that made the entire picture incomplete. He stood slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket out of habit, not for appearance, but for control, and excused himself with a brief nod that required no explanation. The investors did not question it. Not now. Not after what they had just witnessed. And as he walked toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, the sound of the dining room softened behind him, replaced by the quieter rhythm of service, distant voices, the subtle clatter of dishes, the kind of environment he rarely entered, not because he could not, but because he never needed to. The door opened with a muted push, and the atmosphere changed immediately. Warmer, faster, less polished, people moving with purpose, conversations overlapping, but still organized, still controlled in its own way. And there she was, not standing still, not waiting, but working, moving between stations with the same precision he had seen at the table. Except here it was faster, more efficient, less observed, and somehow more revealing. Claire did not notice him at first, or if she did, she chose not to react. She finished placing an order slip, adjusted a tray, and only then turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second before returning to her task. No surprise, no discomfort, just acknowledgement. "You should not be back here," she said quietly, not confrontational, just factual. Ethan stopped a few feet away, taking in the scene, the contrast between the room he had left and the one he had entered. "And yet I am," he replied, his tone controlled but no longer distant. She picked up a glass, inspected it briefly, then set it aside. "Your table is taken care of," she added, still not looking directly at him. "The deal is done." "Because of you," he said, and that made her pause, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him. She exhaled softly, almost imperceptible. "Because of clarity," she corrected, finally meeting his gaze, "something that tends to get lost in rooms like yours." There was no accusation in her voice, no bitterness, just a statement, and that made it harder to dismiss. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You understood everything before anyone else did," he said. "That is not something people learn casually." Claire held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked past him, toward the doorway, toward the dining room she had just left behind. "Some people do not have the luxury of misunderstanding things," she replied. And there it was again, not an explanation, but something deeper, something he could not immediately unpack, a history she was not offering. The manager's voice cut through briefly from across the kitchen, calling her name, and she turned without hesitation, responding with a calm, "Coming," before looking back at Ethan one last time. "You should go back," she said, not dismissive, not cold, just certain. "Your world is still out there." Ethan did not move right away, his eyes steady on her. "And yours is here," he said, not as a question, but as an observation. Claire shook her head slightly, a faint, almost invisible gesture. "For now," she said, and then she was gone again, moving deeper into the rhythm of the kitchen, leaving him standing in a place he did not belong, holding on to a conversation that had given him answers and taken more away at the same time. And as he turned slowly, stepping back toward the door, the quiet realization settled in. This was not about a waitress who spoke another language. It was about someone who had chosen silence until it mattered, and he had just seen what happened when that silence ended. When Ethan stepped back into the dining room, the applause had already faded into polite conversation, the kind that followed success but never revealed how close it had come to failure. The contract rested where he had signed it, still warm under the soft lighting, still real, but it no longer held his attention the way it should have. Instead, his mind stayed anchored to the quiet certainty in Claire's voice, the way she had said "for now," as if time itself was something she managed carefully, something she refused to waste. He returned to his seat, but he did not sit immediately, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair as he looked across the table. The investors were speaking again, more relaxed now, one of them even smiling, but their eyes shifted toward him with a new awareness, not just of him, but of what had just happened. "Your associate," the oldest investor said again, this time with a slight nod of approval. "She understands the language of respect." Ethan exhaled slowly, taking his seat. "She is not my associate," he replied, and for the first time that night, The words felt incomplete, not wrong, but insufficient. The man tilted his head slightly, studying him. Then you should consider changing that, he said, calmly, and the table fell quiet for a brief moment. Not tense, not awkward, just thoughtful, because the suggestion carried weight beyond a simple compliment. It was an acknowledgement of value, the kind that did not come easily. Ethan nodded once, controlled, but inside the idea had already taken root, not as an impulse, but as a calculation, one that extended beyond the restaurant, beyond the evening, into something larger, something he had not planned for. The dinner concluded with measured efficiency, handshakes exchanged, agreements confirmed, the kind of ending that would normally satisfy him completely. But tonight it felt different, as if the most important part of the evening had happened outside the contract, outside the structure he trusted, and that left a space he could not ignore. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine mist, the city lights reflecting off the pavement in quiet patterns. Ethan paused at the entrance, his driver already waiting, the car door open, but he did not step inside immediately. Instead, he glanced back through the glass, toward the interior he had just left, toward the kitchen beyond the walls, toward someone who had already returned to being unseen. And for a moment, he considered walking away, leaving it as it was, a single unexpected encounter, a disruption that had already served its purpose. But that was not how he operated. He did not leave variables unexplored. He did not ignore what he did not understand, and Claire Bennett was now both. He stepped into the car slowly, closing the door with a soft click, the city moving around him as the vehicle pulled away, but his focus remained fixed, his mind already shifting into motion, patterns forming, connections building, because there had been something in the investor's reaction, something beyond respect, something closer to recognition. And that detail did not fit neatly into the version of Claire he had seen, a waitress who chose silence until it mattered, a woman who corrected intent without claiming credit. And that meant there was more, much more. And as the city lights blurred into streaks across the window, Ethan Whitmore made a decision with the same quiet certainty he used for every move that mattered. He would not just remember her. He would find her story, every part of it. Because people like Claire Bennett did not simply disappear back into the background, not after being seen, and not after changing the outcome of a room they were never supposed to control. The car ride did not feel like a transition. It felt like an extension of the room he had just left, except quieter, more controlled. The city moving in blurred reflections against the glass while Ethan Whitmore sat still, his gaze unfocused but his mind precise, reconstructing every detail with the same discipline he used to build companies from nothing. The angle of her voice, the timing of her silence, the way she chose exactly when to speak and when to let others reveal themselves. It was not instinct, not entirely. It was something trained, something sharpened over time, and that meant there was a pattern behind it, something he could trace. The car slowed to a stop in front of his building, but he did not step out immediately. Instead, he reached for his phone, not hesitating, not second-guessing, just acting. "I need a full background on someone," he said as soon as the line connected, his tone calm, controlled, the same tone that moved markets without raising volume. "Name is Claire Bennett. She works at La Mira Dining." A brief pause, then a response on the other end. Efficient, unquestioning. "Understood." Timeline. Ethan looked out the window, watching a pedestrian cross the street, unnoticed by the passing cars. "I want preliminary by morning," he said, then ended the call before anything else could be asked. The door opened, the cool night air brushing against his face. But his focus had already moved ahead, because this was no longer about curiosity, it was about alignment. Something in her did not match her position, and that kind of imbalance always had a reason. Inside his apartment, the space was quiet, controlled, everything in its place, the kind of environment built for clarity. But tonight it felt incomplete, as if something had followed him in without being visible. He loosened his tie slightly, setting it aside, his watch next. Each movement deliberate. But his thoughts did not slow. They moved faster, sharper, pulling threads from memory, the investor's reaction, the subtle recognition in his eyes, the way he had shifted from testing to respect without hesitation. That was not common, not in those circles, not unless there was history, and history meant records, connections, something that could be found. Ethan moved toward the window, looking out over the city, thousands of lights stretching in every direction, each one a story, each one a possibility. And somewhere in that grid was Claire Bennett, returning to a life that did not reflect who she was, choosing invisibility in a world that rewarded presence. And that choice interested him more than anything else, because people did not hide without reason, not with that level of discipline, not with that kind of control. Hours passed without him noticing, the city shifting from night into the first quiet hints of morning. And when his phone finally buzzed, on the table behind him, he turned immediately, crossing the room in 2 steps. The message was short, precise, just the way he expected. Preliminary report attached. Ethan opened it without hesitation, his eyes scanning quickly at first, then slowing, focusing, recalibrating as the information began to form a picture, not complete, not yet, but enough to disrupt the assumptions he had built. Education records, incomplete, gaps that did not make sense, language certifications far beyond what her current position required, and then a single line that made him stop, really stop, a reference to a translation project years ago, high level, international, the kind of work that never reached public records. And suddenly the investor's reaction clicked into place, not coincidence, not chance, recognition. Ethan leaned back slightly, the weight of the realization settling in with quiet certainty. Claire Bennett had not just understood the room. She had been part of rooms like that before, at a level he had not considered. And now the question was no longer who she was, but why she had stepped away, why someone with that background would choose to disappear into a role that required her to be unseen. And as the first light of morning touched the edges of the city skyline, Ethan Whitmore understood that he was no longer investigating a waitress. He was uncovering a decision, one that had been made long before he ever walked into that restaurant, and one that he intended to understand completely. Morning did not rush into the city. It unfolded slowly, light stretching across glass towers while the streets below began to fill with quiet purpose. And Claire Bennett stepped out of a subway entrance 3 blocks from the restaurant. Her coat pulled close, her pace steady, as if the night before had not shifted anything at all. But it had. She could feel it in the way her thoughts did not settle, in the way one moment kept replaying without asking permission, the look on Ethan Whitmore's face when he realized she understood him, not the words, but the weight behind them. She exhaled softly, pushing the memory aside as she reached the small apartment building she called home. Nothing about it suggested the kind of world she had once moved in. No marble floors, no quiet contracts signed over crystal glasses, just a narrow hallway, a flickering light, and a door that required a second turn of the key to close properly. Inside, the space was modest, clean, deliberate, everything placed with intention. A small table, a single bookshelf, a folded letter resting near the window. She paused when she saw it, not touching it immediately, just standing there for a second longer than necessary. Then she moved past it, setting her bag down, removing her coat, returning to routine, because routine was how she kept control, how she stayed grounded in a life she had chosen, not one she had been forced into. Across the city, Ethan Whitmore did not slow down, the report still open in his hand as he stepped into his office. The early hour giving him space most people never experienced. Quiet, uninterrupted, focused. He placed the file on his desk, reading through it again, slower this time, not searching for facts, but for patterns, the missing years, the incomplete records, the translation work that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and one detail that stood out more than the rest, a reference to a government contract, not public, not detailed, but enough to confirm that Claire Bennett had once operated in spaces far beyond private dining rooms, spaces where language was not just communication, but leverage, influence, control. He leaned back slightly, processing, because that changed everything. People did not walk away from that level without a reason, and reasons left traces. He reached for his phone again, sending a brief message, expand search. Focus on 5-year gap, no assumptions, just facts. The response came quickly, understood, and as he set the phone down, his gaze shifted toward the window, the city now fully awake, moving with purpose, unaware of the quiet investigation unfolding above it. Back in her apartment, Claire finally reached for the folded letter, her fingers pausing just before touching it. as if the paper itself carried weight. Then she picked it up, opening it carefully, her eyes scanning the lines she already knew by heart. Not new information, but a reminder, something that anchored her to the decision she had made, a decision that had required her to step away, to become someone else, to trade recognition for control. She folded it again slowly, placing it back exactly where it had been. No hesitation, no doubt, just certainty, because whatever had happened the night before, whatever shift had taken place in that room, it did not change why she was here. And yet, as she moved toward the window, looking out at the same city Ethan was studying from a different height, a different world, there was a subtle awareness she could not ignore. Something had started, something that would not remain contained to one evening. And as she stood there in the quiet morning light, Claire Bennett understood one thing clearly. She had chosen to remain unseen, but now that she had been noticed, that choice might not remain entirely hers. The city carried on as if nothing had changed, taxis moving in steady lines, people crossing streets without looking up, glass towers reflecting a sky that did not pause for anyone. But inside Ethan Whitmore's office, the pace had narrowed to something sharper, more focused. The second report arrived just before noon, longer this time, more detailed, and he read it without interruption, every line adding weight to a truth he could no longer ignore. Claire Bennett had not simply stepped away from a career, she had exited a world where precision mattered more than presence, where one sentence could shift outcomes across continents. The 5-year gap was no longer empty. It was deliberate, filled with contracts that did not carry names, projects that did not exist on paper, and then a final note, brief but enough, a sudden withdrawal, no explanation, no public trace, just absence. Ethan set the file down slowly, the quiet in the room settling around him. Because this was not a fall from success, it was a choice, and people did not make that kind of choice without something forcing the decision, or something worth protecting. Across the city, Claire moved through her day with the same measured rhythm. The morning shift blending into the afternoon, orders taken, plates delivered, conversations overheard but never absorbed. The same invisible presence she had mastered. But there was a difference now, subtle, almost imperceptible, a heightened awareness in the way she noticed small details. A glance held half a second longer, a voice recognized before it spoke. Not fear, not anxiety, just calculation, the kind that came from knowing something had shifted. When the afternoon slowed and the restaurant quieted between services, she stepped outside. Briefly, the air cool, the noise of the street grounding, and for a moment she allowed herself stillness, not the practiced stillness of control, but something more honest, something that acknowledged the truth she had already accepted. The night before had not been contained. It had extended beyond the room, beyond her control, and that meant the balance she had maintained for years was no longer entirely hers to manage. Back in his office, Ethan stood by the window again, the file now closed. But not forgotten, his reflection faint against the skyline. And for the first time since the investigation began, he did not reach for his phone, did not issue another instruction, because the information was no longer the question. The decision was. He had found her story, or at least the outline of it, enough to understand that approaching her as a problem to solve would be a mistake. She had already proven she did not respond to pressure, did not move for money. And that meant if he wanted answers, if he wanted to understand why someone like Claire Bennett chose silence over recognition, he would have to do something he rarely did. He would have to step into her world without trying to control it. The thoughts settled slowly, unfamiliar but clear, and as the afternoon light shifted across the glass, Ethan Whitmore realized that this was no longer about uncovering information. It was about earning it. And across the city, as Claire turned back toward the restaurant door, her hand pausing briefly on the handle before pushing it open, she understood something just as clearly. The moment she had spoken had changed more than the outcome of a deal. It had changed who was now watching, and some stories did not end when they were discovered. They only became more difficult to keep hidden, because once someone truly sees you, the question is no longer whether they understand, but whether they are willing to meet you where you stand, and neither of them had stepped into that answer yet.